serving as trailblazers for us, it would have been a lot worse. All right. Hope it was worth the effort. You're in the middle of Henagan's Redoubt. It's a little bit grown up this time of year, but it's still a great, pristine, original Confederate-built fort that saw some pretty interesting combat on the afternoon of May the 23rd, 150 years ago. To orient you, you all, the majority of you at least, are facing north, that way. This is the north wall of the redoubt. And the redoubt is just an earthen fort, and this is called Henagan's Redoubt because it was Henagan's brigade of South Carolinians who had responsibility for defending this bridgehead. And if you brought your maps with you, you certainly ought to be able to get oriented on the overall maps on the front, but then look at the second map in your package. And this is taken from the first book on the North Anna campaign by Mike Miller, which is now out of print, Even to Hell Itself, which is a very good history of North Anna. Probably not quite as good as Gordon Ray's because Gordon had access to so much more material, but they're both highly recommended. But the one that says Chesterfield Bridge, make sure you figured out which direction is north, and then look down there at the bottom, and you can see 2SC for 2nd South Carolina Infantry, and then you can see Henagan's Redoubt, kind of a little bristly shape drawn just above the 2nd North Carolina. That represents the fortifications where we're standing, and of course the fort would have been empty of trees and tall grass in 1864, and as Cameron said a few minutes ago, most of this ground was pretty barren in 1864. That's especially important from a defensive point of view, looking north, looking through our bus at the Telegraph Road, looking west of that, north and west. All of the approach ground for about half a mile was open, treeless in 1864. And the reason this fort was built here was not because of the North Anna campaign, but to protect against Union cavalry raids, because the Chesterfield Bridge, the Telegraph Road crossing of the North Anna River, is 200 yards or so in that direction to my left front. We're going to try and walk down there when we leave here, and I'll show you where the crossing was. So this is built to defend the highway bridge against Union cavalry. It was apparently built around Christmas of 1863. I still have not figured out who built it, who ordered it built, or who did the labor. Can't figure it out. But I do know December of 1863, at least I think I know December of 1863. So why were the Confederates even here? Here comes the whole Union 2nd Corps thundering to the south. The Confederates have the river at their back. All of the Army of Northern Virginia across on the south bank, except for Henagan's 1 brigade of South Carolinians. Henagan was not a general, he was the senior colonel in what had been Kershaw's South Carolina brigade. Joseph B. Kershaw, now commanding a division. Henagan was not a very suitable brigade commander. There's a lot of evidence. There was nothing wrong with him. He wasn't incompetent. He just didn't quite have what it took to be a full brigade commander. He was, before the war, the sheriff of Marlborough District in South Carolina, 41 years old at the time of the battle here, and put in a very difficult situation because the Confederates did not intend to defend the bridgehead. There's no evidence that Lee expected 4.5 regiments of South Carolinians to repulse the entire 2nd Corps. They were just kind of here, keeping the road open so that Rooney Lee's cavalry could fall back across the bridge. Any straggling Confederates could fall back across the bridge. It is almost 100% certain that Lee expected to fall back himself with Henagan's men, burn the bridge, and use the river as a barrier between himself and the Federal Army as it approached from the north. But something went haywire. Something broke down. The South Carolinians blamed Rooney Lee, the general's son, for not announcing when he had cleared their front, when he was out of the way. The South Carolinians were so unprepared that when Hancock showed up and formed Birney's division for a frontal assault against this bridgehead, some of the South Carolinians were buck naked swimming in the North Anna River, just down the hill. That's how unprepared they were. Now you can see the deployment in gratifying detail on your map, both for the Confederates, 2nd South Carolina by itself in this fort, 3rd South Carolina Battalion opposite our bus, 3rd South Carolina Infantry over near the Brick Rancher House that Cameron pointed to earlier, 7th South Carolina Infantry just a tiny bit upriver to the west, to my left as I look out across the attack field. And then here comes Birney's division of Hancock's Corps. And the amazing thing to me is that there were so few casualties in the battle for Henagan's Redoubt. You would think that with veteran, seasoned Confederates manning earthen fortifications like this with half-a-mile field of fire, admittedly they didn't have any artillery with them on this side of the river, but still, with an excellent field of fire, that they could have done more damage, and that when the fort was overrun, as it ultimately was, that there would have been more casualties among the South Carolinians. But that's just not the way it developed. The 2nd South Carolina casualties in the battle for Henagan's Redoubt, 2nd South Carolina right here in the fort, 0 killed, 0 wounded, 3 prisoners. So it shows that they did not really put up that much of a fight. Now I'm going to contradict myself by reading you some accounts from some of Birney's men who talk about bitter fighting right on the walls of the fort. Other South Carolina units did suffer heavier casualties. The regular 3rd South Carolina off to the right was one of them, so I'm not suggesting Confederate casualties were insignificant. They just were not what I would expect them to be here in Henagan's Redoubt. Seemed more dramatic, perhaps, than it really was. Read you just a few accounts from people. The 3rd South Carolina, which I showed you on the map a little bit earlier. Everything okay over there, Art? All right. 3rd South Carolina, which I showed you on the map across the Telegraph Road bridge, they quickly saw that they were going to be cut off if they didn't retreat, and so the commanding officer yelled, "Each man for himself." It's never a good sign if you're in the defensive force. Each man for himself. And some of them scampered across the bridge, and some of them swam across the North Anna River on their own. The 72nd New York, you all recognize that regiment? That would be one of the original ones from Dan Sickles' brigade, what they used to call the Excelsior Brigade early in the war. 70th, 71st, 72nd, 73rd, 74th New York Infantry. Here's the 72nd, still in business. 72nd, 120th New York, and 141st Pennsylvania were credited as reaching this fort first, having stormed across half a mile of open ground, and a corporal and a captain of the 72nd New York jammed their bayonets into the exterior wall of the fort to create an impromptu ladder, steps, and a sergeant named James Anderson started up the ladder with the flag of the 72nd New York and was killed, but someone else took the flag and planted them dramatically here on the ramparts of Henagan's Redoubt, followed very quickly by the Pennsylvania flag. This from a Pennsylvanian in Egan's brigade. He's one of the first ones into the ditch, which he said was nearly 10 feet deep. Now, we walked around the exterior of the ditch. We didn't get down into the bottom of it, but when we leave, you can look to your right on this outer wall. He measured it from the bottom of the ditch to the top of the parapet as being 10 feet. And this Pennsylvanian said, "I said to Sergeant Seagraves, 'Mount my shoulders.' So I leaned my hands and my head against the embankment, and he was soon on my shoulders and on top of the fortifications. How many went up that ladder, I do not recollect. When our flag was up, I preferred to be relieved. So Sergeant Seagraves reached down and pulled up the ladder by which he had mounted the parapet." So there's a human ladder, as well as various bayonets. This from a Confederate, 3rd South Carolina Battalion. He said, "If ever I enjoyed a battle, that was the one." You wouldn't think that from a South Carolinian on the edge of Henagan's Redoubt. And the reason was because he was standing beside a person with a globe-sighted Whitworth rifle, one of the rare Confederate snipers, although they didn't call them snipers at that time, and watched him pick off various Union officers from Birney's division at extremely long range. So that's why this fellow enjoyed this battle more than any others. He said, "Our whole attention was to those in front of us, and finally someone yelled, 'Look out, boys, look to the left.' Our brigade was falling back, and the Yankee colors was almost in our rear. Many of our men waded the river. I crossed on the bridge, and when I got across, the Yankee colors were on the opposite end of the bridge." So that's how narrow an escape it was for some of these Confederates. There was no great resistance. There was never any doubt that Birney was going to capture this position. The bigger question, of course, is why were the Confederates here, and then why did they not succeed in burning the bridge and blocking that pursuit? I have 2 photographs I want to pass around for you, and 1 or 2 other things to say, and I'll answer some questions. The best photograph, although it is not very clear, here it is. You won't make any sense of it until it comes around to you individually. The photographers were traveling with the Federal Army. They took a whole series of famous views. You'll recognize some of them as I pass them around. traveling right with the Federal Army, but there is at least one photograph of Henagan's Redoubt taken right in here, very close to where we're standing. The camera might have been right where I'm standing now, looking in that direction right after the battle, and the glass plate for that photograph does not survive. So that means when you go to the Library of Congress and you download those super high resolution Civil War photographs that are so spectacular, there's probably 20 of them for North Anna, but not this one. This one only survives as an original stereo view card. The only way you can see it is to own one of those original cards, because some intern or something dropped the glass plate negative on the floor and it's broken forever and it's gone. So the only way the photograph survives. And this, unfortunately, is about the best one of them all. This could win prizes for its composition and its artfulness, because it shows the corner of the fort right there. It shows a Union cannon that was placed here to look out across the river after the fort was captured. There's an American flag planted right on the corner, flapping in the breeze. And in the distance, you can see the Chesterfield Bridge. All of that framed into this one super rare photograph. I've never seen an original stereo view of it. I want to own one. If any of you see one, let me know. Add it to the Crick Library. This one comes from the New York Historical Society up in New York. That's the only one I know of that exists. I'm sure there's some others in private collections. Make sure you see this. It probably won't get to all of you before we get back to the bus. So just make sure you see it, and when I get back on the bus, I'll make an announcement and pass it around again if I have to. The other one is this view, which is also thought to be in Henagan's Redoubt. This one's much more clear than the glass plate negative, and that seems to be taken looking in that direction. You can't see the river in this one, but it does show the defenses. Once the Federal troops captured this then became one of many forts that they built, or fortifications that they built along the river to try and dominate the South Bank. Because at every place along the North Anna River, except at Ox Ford over there, the North Bank dominated the South Bank. It's another reason why the North Anna was indefensible from the Confederate point of view. They were always menaced by higher ground, looking down on them from the north side, the Caroline County side of the river. Read you one or two more quotes, answer some questions, we'll go to the bridge. This from another South Carolinian, written on May the 23rd. He said, "We was left to guard a bridge across the North Anna River. The Yankees flanked us on our left, and you ought to have saw us running. We only had one place to get out or wade the river. Some went to the bridge and the rest took to the river where they come to it." Complete with misspellings. And then this from the colonel of the 3rd South Carolina, Colonel William Dunlap Rutherford, writing to his wife afterwards, he said, "We had a terrible time on the 23rd. My orders were not to fight a heavy force. The enemy advanced a column on my right, then they advanced a brigade on my left and rear, and I thought it was time to be getting my few men away. So after holding them a while, I gave the order to retire. The enemy followed so close that most of the men were cut off from the bridge and had to take to the river. You never saw such a drowned set in your life after we all got on this side. It was a most dangerous position to hold, and how we escaped is miraculous. General Kershaw is much censured for keeping us on the other side while our entire army was on the south side, and our only means of escape, an old bridge ready to tumble into the water." So he wasn't even impressed with the Chesterfield Bridge. So he blamed General Kershaw. Others have blamed Robert E. Lee for not paying close enough attention and extracting his marooned force. Others have blamed his son, Rooney Lee, for not announcing when he had passed back through and the front was now completely full of Yankees. And others, probably incorrectly, have blamed Colonel Henagan for not reading the handwriting on the wall and getting across while he still could. Confederate losses were still not very numerous, perhaps 150, something like that, most of them prisoners of war. There were a couple of Union Medals of Honor awarded for bravery in this frontal assault, but the combined casualties here were very, very minor compared to Jericho Mill, compared to almost any other battle of the Overland campaign. Not to say it's not significant, but I would say it's more interesting than anything else. And it's especially interesting because the fort is still here, and we can still visit it. If the fort wasn't here, would we make this a stop on a North Anna battlefield tour? Probably not. The fort is what, the fort and the pristine ground around it, and the bed of the Telegraph Road is what makes it worth visiting, especially on the 150th. Any questions about anything in here?